Assalamu alaikum and welcome to another program. We've been talking about injustice and achieving justice in our localities, in our families, in community and in society, and trying to think of the different kinds of injustice that we might see or sometimes not actually notice. And by learning about them, by talking about them, by exposing them, that we can change things for the better. So today I want to talk about something that is perhaps not thought of as relevant to our daily lives, or perhaps something that happens elsewhere or in the history, and that is slavery. Slavery is again another slightly sensitive topic because of its long history in humankind, in all different situations, in different contexts, in different societies, in different histories. Slavery has existed for as long as humans have existed. And within the Islamic context, of course, Islam came into a situation where slavery was part of the daily economic system. People were slaves and people were free. People were able to become from slavery to be free people, and people, of course, were bought and sold. So there was a system there which Islam interacted with. So often we hear, oh well, in Islam slavery is somehow permitted or promoted. But if we have a look at the actual details and what happens, yes, Islam addresses slavery, but the promotion of injustice within that system, and in terms of enslaving and continuing the system, it becomes much more contested and debated. And I want to examine what the history of slavery is, particularly in the Western context, which is quite different from that of other societies and other histories, where the commodification of slaves and the continuing dehumanization of people, so that the people were considered to be less than human and not able to become free people or not ever to achieve freedom, was something that embedded a lot of very dangerous attitudes, and attitudes that we see in the context of racism, in the context of the way that we see each other. There are a few examples that I wanted to flag up at the beginning. For example, the idea that people with darker skins, particularly of African heritage, are somehow inherently linked to slavery and often insulted in this way, or seen as lesser people or somehow inferior to others. And even the word abd and its connection with our African brothers and sisters and African heritage brothers and sisters is something that we don't like to talk about, but of course exists and is common. And again, this isn't just about the personal insults and damage that comes, but it constructs us in very unjust and unequal and racist ways, and that's not something that we wish to tolerate as individuals, and it's not something that we should tolerate as societies. So thinking back to the history of slavery beyond the Islamic world and into the Western and more recent capitalist system that we have in place now, I'd like to look at the actual history there and then talk about the contemporary times after that. So it's often easy to think of history as literally something that's gone past and isn't relevant. But as a social scientist, I would argue that if we understand history as connected to us still, and something that we are generating all the time and that we are, shaped by, it becomes very important. And it also relates to the situation that we find ourselves, particularly the economic system and the global politics that shape our lives, shape the conflicts, and shape the cultural influences that we experience. So when we think about slavery, we think often about the use of people forced to do labour and generate profit for their slave owners. And if we see that more looking back into history about how it was connected to the economics and the rise of power, particularly in Western Europe. So the idea that people could go out and colonise different areas, that is, invade, not only invade, but take root there and used the local populations to create systems of exploitation of people and exploitation of the land and resources. So the British Empire, but also many other empires, were extremely efficient at going out and creating a system which was on a global scale. And in fact, we can see the global economic system now reflecting this historical one, where a country would go in, get the population involved, get certain members of a population in a system of divide and rule to take over, so that there were members of the indigenous population who would rule over others, who would allow the exploitation and encourage the exploitation for their own gain. So there was a complicity with the elite of some areas who would then help the outside forces to exploit the land, the people, and the political situation. So the UK, for example, our wealth now and our political standing within the global situation at the moment is still resting on the ability to use, for example, the cotton that was grown, the sugar that was grown, to manufacture it in the UK through import, through very exploitative processes, and then to sell those goods that had been essentially grown and bought at the expense of people's food in the countries that they came from, in expense of the welfare and livelihood and well-being of those communities, to then go and sell them and create more wealth. So there was literally a draining of wealth from the global south to the global north, in which economic gain and political gain and social gain was built. So this is where we see this huge division that even today we see between the global north and global south, between those of us who have and those of us who have not. And within that system, slavery was absolutely imperative. It was a way of exploiting the labour and physical abilities of men, women and children in order to generate this economic achievement. And in particular, we see the literal robbery of the African continent, particularly the west coast of the African continent, to gain people. And this is often seen as not just as a bad thing that happened in the past, but as an absolute genocide, a genocide of many millions of people who were not only, some of whom managed to survive the journeys that took them to other lands, but many of whom actually died on those journeys and whose bodies were cast in the sea and who were murdered on board these merchant ships. So we see the robbery of people and their use in different places, such as the Caribbean islands and all over, in which the physical labour was used, and when people's bodies literally gave way, they were cast aside, so treated worse than animals. This is human beings. So what were the reasons behind this? Okay, there was obvious economic gain, there was the political power, but there was also this idea that justified what was going on. So this actual exploitative system, one that was brutal and murdered people and exploited them as if they weren't animals, was based on a number of ideas. And these ideas, I think, are crucial to remember because they're something that is reflected in our own prejudices and racisms today. And in particular, and I've spoken about this before, but it's important to keep thinking about it, is this system of social Darwinism. The idea that Darwinistic ideas of the Victorian times, in which the idea of evolution of species and survival of the fittest was transmitted to the idea of the social world. And what did that mean? That meant that people could start trying to justify and explain differences and divisions between people as a form of evolution. And that some people were superior, i.e. more evolved, and that some people were more inferior, i.e. less evolved. So these ideas could be used to justify all sorts of forms of exploitation. On the one hand, the working class, the people who didn't have much money, who were used to work in the factories but not allowed to rise through the systems because they weren't allowed to vote, they weren't allowed to earn property, they were never able to have the opportunity of education. So people kept in poverty within the countries who were themselves elite and ruling and wealthy were considered to be poor because of their own problems, because of their own natural inability, because they were less evolved people. They were poor because it was their fault. They were poor because they could always only be poor, because they were not capable somehow of becoming more successful people. So the system wasn't blamed, the system was hidden and an excuse blamed upon the people, that this was about natural selection, that the weak would die back and the strong naturally achieve, naturally rise up. Similarly, the use of slavery in relation to people of different ethnic and racial backgrounds. So the idea of race in itself was developed, to think that somehow the white man was a more evolved species or in a more evolved part of the species than those with darker skin. So in Victorian times, a whole science was developed that looked at, for example, facial features. And again, the European facial features were considered to be more evolved facial features than those of African and other indigenous areas such as Australasia. By doing this, by saying people were more evolved or less evolved, they then managed to justify that behaviour against people with darker skins, with different facial features, and particularly from the African subcontinent, were inferior and less human. So by saying people are less human, by saying Africans are less human, are more inferior to those of lighter skinned people, they then not only justified their treatment of human beings as animals, but they also suggested that not only were they justified in doing it, that they were actually able to improve people's lives, to civilize countries, to come across and promote their own Western European ways of being as a way of civilization. So one could exploit people, one could use the bodies and use people as slaves, but one could also then justify that this was good for those people, that it was good for those countries. So in an exploitative system in which economic gain was justified through the exploitation that was dressed up in science, was dressed up in an idea that somehow this was not only okay, but was actually a positive thing for all of the people involved. So this whole history, this murky backdrop to our current social and political and economic systems has a very real and important and terrible effect today. And after the break, I'd like to talk about how the economic impact of those times of slavery and colonialism still is felt today, but also that those ideas that some people are naturally inferior and some people are superior, and that the superior can exploit the inferior for their own good, still exists today. The prejudices that that system built up against people with different shades of skin, that brought enmity between those people in a way that certainly the Islamic framework has always worked against, and is something that we can't try to justify because we have either been part of it in our heritages, or that we somehow understand our rights and our duties as incorporating that kind of mentality. So please join me after the break, and Assalamu alaikum. Assalamu alaikum and welcome back. Before the break, I was discussing not only the importance of charity and the importance of looking out for those who need help, but of recognising the humanity and dignity of those people, and also the different groups, and recognising the struggles people have depending on their situation. So refugees and asylum seekers, the persecution, physical and emotional and psychological, that they have fled from, but also the challenges that people can face in our societies, in our communities, of rejection, of stigmatization, and of restriction economically and socially, that it become very difficult to bear. And also the ways that we can sometimes inflict further injustice by our attitudes, or simply by not seeing or wanting to address some of the problems. And I'd begun to talk about the victims of alcohol and drug abuse. And again, because from a Muslim perspective, drinking alcohol and taking drugs are a haram issue, it becomes very difficult to sometimes address those problems. So, for example, if we see the results of drug and alcohol abuse on a family, on an individual, we see destruction and unhappiness and damage to the health as well as the welfare of not only the individual but of those people who are in contact with that person. But saying that it's haram and pushing it under the table or not acknowledging it doesn't actually get to the bottom of the issue. So accessing services, accessing experts, realizing that there's a problem and not berating that individual for their failures as Muslims or as failures as people, but actually supporting them as with any form of illness, because at the point of addiction it becomes an illness, it becomes something that person cannot control very easily, or certainly not without help and intervention. Then this is a situation. So sometimes those in need of charity and in need of need are those who we actually tend to revile or tend to insult. And again, that's not helping justice, that's perpetuating further injustice and further problems. And then there are other groups of people who we, again, don't wish to acknowledge and who we stigmatise and marginalise, and that are the sex workers, those who in different ways provide sexual services for money. Now that can be survival sex work, those people, male and female, who are providing forms of prostitution on our streets or in exploitative situations where there is very little choice from an economic perspective, and sometimes even in the context of forms of coercion, who are engaged in this kind of work. And of course, this kind of work has always existed and will probably continue to exist. But if we don't address the needs of those people who are involved in it, if we continue to criminalise those people, if we criminalise women and their clients in a way that actually drives things underground, we can actually cause more damage. So there are lots of stories, and Muslims are often very happy about how we have driven prostitutes, driven sex workers out of an area, have taken the problem elsewhere. But actually, is that a solution? The fact is that men from our communities are accessing these kind of services. And there are women from our communities and from wider communities and wider societies who are engaged in this kind of work for whatever reason, usually economic. And sometimes, as I say, sometimes coerced, sometimes not coerced, but their situations remain very difficult in a context where the police are likely to arrest rather than address situations of injustice, where violent attacks, where murders are rife, where sexual assault is rife. And therefore, it's very easy to feel righteous and superior about what people may or may not do in terms of sex work. But we don't address injustices if we either ignore it or just reject people per se for what they are engaged in. It also creates vulnerabilities for young people, and we see across our cities young women in particular who are vulnerable and who are easy to exploit in these different ways, and who get pulled into this world, not necessarily of sex work, but of sexual exploitation more broadly, who fall victim to people who are able to perhaps provide economic stability, but not the emotional and physical welfare of these individuals. So again, this is happening amongst Muslims, it's also happening amongst non-Muslims, but as communities, as members, as citizens of our societies, these are our problems as well. And scorn and superiority is not going to help the matters at all. And again, it's perhaps good to remind ourselves about the imperative within our religion, from a religious tradition. And there are certain things that charities, for example, use to motivate us as individuals, particularly from the Muslim perspective. And the first one is rahmah. If we have mercy for all of the people around us, you know, whether they do good, whether they do bad, whether they are in privileged positions or unprivileged positions, if we have that attitude where the mercy that we hope and pray for from Allah, we can, you know, embody in our own acts, our own actions and our own attitudes. This is something crucial to you know, bringing people together in a positive way and addressing some of those injustices. Another beautiful concept from within the Islamic framework is adl, of social justice, of the responsibility that we all have to understand the world around us, to open our eyes and to realise that we are not just individuals with our own lives, but we are part of communities, part of a wider society in which injustices happen, but that which we are responsible communally for trying to stop. So of course we have individual obligations, but we also have communal obligations, and social justice is absolutely an extremely strong part of this. And then underpinning this, because often, you know, we perhaps fall into the trap of feeling that charity, that sadaqah, that helping the needy can in fact inflate our own egos. We can feel good about ourselves more than we're feeling good about the recipient of our generosity or the recipient of our help. And then sincerity is something that is useful to think about. Ikhlas, of thinking, you know, what are my motivations? Am I, you know, helping this individual? Am I helping this group of people? Or am I feeding my own insecurities and feeding my own, you know, to feel good about it? Because it feels good when we do something good, and that's not a bad thing, but it can taint what we do, and it can taint the experience of those we help. If someone senses that you're helping them with, you know, for your own good, this can often create more problems and more senses of victimization than not helping. So feeling inferior or feeling patronized can add to someone's suffering more than it can be relieved by the kind of help being provided. So the sincerity, and the sincerity not for ourselves, but sincerity to Allah, is obviously the backbone of this. And in talking about these issues, one of the most important concepts in addition to these is custodianship, the idea of amana, of looking after, from a duty perspective, those that we have responsibility for. And that trust for those for whom we are not only responsible in a direct way, whether it's our children or our spouses or our elderly parents, but also the duty towards those people and other things within our jurisdiction. So, for example, I'll talk about animal welfare another time, but even the animals in our houses, in our gardens, the birds in the trees, the cats on the ground. I mean, this is all custodianship, but it also custodianship over our own communities. We have a stake in our environments, and we have a stake in our societies. we're not these individuals without responsibility, but we have that duty and that dignity afforded to all of us. So again, coming together, and that goes beyond the sectarian divisions that we often make. Sectarianism is something that can even infect charity giving. As Muslims, we often think about Muslim issues that affect our communities most, of conflicts that affect us most. But actually, if we have a look at our responsibility more broadly, we see that all these issues of injustices are relevant to us, whether they're affecting Muslims or not. We are humans and we have custodianship, we have that amana towards our own families and communities, but more broadly. So that's a framework for seeing the practical aspects of addressing injustice, and particularly for those in need, and for those people in need who we are sometimes uncomfortable to talk to, uncomfortable to talk about their situations, such as people with homelessness, such as refugees, or such as those who we have a lot of blame for, whether that's those engaged in sex work or those who may be addicted to drugs and alcohol. So I hope that has been useful, and again brought out some of the issues that we don't really feel comfortable about. But of course, to make a healthier societies, we need to think about and talk about and try and think of solutions for, using the networks of brilliant community organisations that we have, building more of them, and rather than competing, contributing to. And of course, always telling our politicians, lobbying the state, making tangible changes to the way that we operate as individuals, but also as societies. So thank you, and I hope you'll join me next time, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum.